This is lecture number 5 for your Introduction to Philosophy, Philosophy 100, and in this lecture we'll be looking at arguably the most important philosopher in history, Plato.
Perhaps you will recall from the previous lecture that Plato was considered Socrates' most prized student, most gifted student, and perhaps you've heard the phrase before that the student surpasses the teacher. Well, this is certainly a case of that, in which Plato certainly figures in history much more important and much more influential than Socrates. Many of Plato's eventual teachings on politics that would come out of his philosophy are a direct result of the anger of how his teacher Socrates was treated by the Athenian sophist, and you'll perhaps recall that also from the previous lecture. Plato also established one of the very first formal philosophical academies in which he had students or disciples that attended to receive instruction from him. Also, another thing about Plato is that he is known as the anti-democrat. Not democrat as in our political party today, but anti-democracy as in that form of government. Plato thought certain people were gifted to fill certain positions and should be given that greater privilege and greater responsibility. Because of this, some people consider Plato an elitist, but Plato actually despised elitism if it was in the form of those who would utilize their power to coerce or manipulate others to rule over them, to be tyrants over them. We'll see that that word tyrant or tyrannical will be important to Plato's thought on a later slide. So Plato was very anti-elitist in that fashion, but the fact that there are those who consider him elitist is based upon the fact that he does make the argument that those who have the qualities of wisdom that allow them to have greater knowledge should be given more prominent roles within society. Plato also, with his dislike of the elite, that would extend, and this again goes back to his relationship with Socrates. He also could not tolerate the mob mentality of the Athenians. This goes back to the war between the Athenians and the Spartans, and for a time there Athens was taken over by the Spartans and their council of 30, and then this council of 30 was once again overthrown by the Athenian sophist. These sophists are the same ones who considered Socrates a traitor, and so this is what we mean by mob mentality. Because they considered Socrates a traitor, they grew into an angry mob that brought the downfall of Socrates. This mob mentality is an example of today what we call groupthink, that when you have a few powerful people in the group, their thoughts and their opinions and their convictions are so overstated that it becomes what everyone thinks. And for those of you who are religious, an example of this, if your religion is Christianity, you see that on Holy Week for Christians, when Jesus of Nazareth comes into Jerusalem, you see at first the crowd welcoming him, but then the voice of the religious leaders that have power, that becomes the mob mentality that will eventually drive Jesus to his condemnation in front of Pontius Pilate and, of course, to the cross. So that just gives you another example of what we mean by mob mentality or groupthink. What makes Plato so incredibly significant to Western thought is his dualistic epistemology. Now, once again, epistemology is any sort of theory of knowledge. Epistemology means trying to explain how it is that you can say you know something. How do you know? Dualism, of course, means two. And so we're going to look at the background here of something that we saw in Lecture 3. We had two different sophist philosophers who had very different views on reality. And it would appear that these two could not coexist. We had Heraclitus that argued that everything is always changing, that change is the one thing that is the absolute, the always happening. And Parmenides taught that change was an illusion, that instead things are permanent, things are unchanging. And so these two things, again, appear to be opposite, contradictions. But Plato developed an ontology that sought to combine these two. Plato affirms that, yes, as far as we perceive things or look at things and utilize our five senses, we are seeing that things are constantly changing. But Plato said that change was based solely upon appearance and is not actual. Now, it is a legitimate expression of human experience. Yes, you're logical and correct to say that you see something moving, something changing, because that is your human experience. But Plato argued for a higher kind of knowing, a knowledge that things are permanent. And the primary way that he did this was through his teaching on forms. Now, this is pretty weighty teaching here and can be somewhat complex. Forms would be the things that are permanent, and having knowledge of these things, you realize that what you are seeing as change is just an appearance, that it is an illusion. An example of form that is used in your textbook is that of roundness, that you can imagine you have a picture of what roundness is, but anytime you would attempt to bring that into the physical world with something you could observe with your senses, it would always be imperfect, because even if you tried to draw a perfect circle, all you would have to do is continue to zoom in closer and closer on detail, and eventually you would see that there at least is a fraction of error that that's not exactly roundness. Now, something that helps me, I don't know if it'll help you, form is a confusing term for me, and so I tend to think in terms of concepts. I have the concept of roundness, and so, or even the concept of a particular color, such as redness, that's also used in your textbook. And so we have these concepts, these things that we can imagine, but when we try to put it literally or physically down, it's always going to be imperfect. It's not going to measure up to the perfect form, the perfect idea, or the perfect concept. Now, we do have a few illustrations that Plato gives us to help us understand more what he means by these forms. There's an excellent example, a chart actually given in your textbook, in which we see him first begin with the concept of illusion. And this is when you would perhaps have a painting or a picture of a person. Now, that is not the actual person, but you're getting a glimpse of what that person is like. The person that is used in your textbook is Mother Teresa, and that's a fine example there, that you would have a picture of Mother Teresa, and so you have an idea of what she's like. Now, if you actually see Mother Teresa in person, of course, you're getting a much greater idea of who she is, because you're seeing the actual person rather than just a picture. And so now you're moving up toward more into a concept of what Plato would call knowledge. Now, Mother Teresa is just a person, and so if you're trying to get closer to what a form or a concept is, you would say that you are seeing a person. And so this moves past a particular person to the concept or the form of personhood. Okay, so we go from a picture to an actual person, and now to the broader idea of personhood. And then the highest virtue of all virtues for Plato was the good. And I think that's why your author probably selects Mother Teresa. She's one of the finest human beings to ever live on the earth. And so if you look past the picture to the actual person, to the concept of personhood, and what you would hope personhood would actually encapsulate or embody would be this virtue of the good. And so Plato would say the good is the form, the concept, and so that would be the greatest example of having knowledge. Now, to try to explain this, Plato also used the simile of the sun. And so all you have to do here is to imagine that you're out at nighttime, and let's say that it is very cloudy and there are no street lights anywhere around, and you can't see anything. Now, eventually your eyes might adjust a little bit, and you could make out maybe some outlines of some things that are around you, but you really wouldn't know what they are. But now let's say the clouds clear, and it's a night when there's a full moon. And of course, the moon gives you some greater illumination, and you can see better what it is that is around you. Now you're not only making out some lines, but now you can actually tell, oh, those lines are, it's a tree. I think I can make out that that's a tree. And then Plato, of course, moves all the way through getting out of nighttime, going into the daylight. And it's in the midst of the middle of the day, but it's cloudy. And so you still have the sun out there behind the clouds, and somehow the sun, of course, is still breaking through somewhat. And you can see much better than you could at night. And, of course, our final stage here will be had the clouds clear away. Now you have the sun shining brightly, and you can really make out, you can really see. According to Plato, you would really have knowledge. Now, the teaching of Plato that is the most well known, and I would imagine some of you have heard of this teaching before, is his allegory of the cave. That we together are all in a cave. It is very dark, but we look up, and perhaps we can see the opening of the cave, and it's letting in just a little bit of light. And so we look around, and just like with the simile of the sun, when we just had a little bit of moonlight, we can make out that maybe there are some people around us in the cave, but we have no idea what their facial features are like. We can't make out one person from another. We know that we're surrounded by others, but we have no knowledge. We don't really know what it is that is around us. And Plato speaks of one being able to escape and getting out of the cave. And at first, of course, being in the sunlight for the very first time, now that you're out of the cave, your eyes are having to take some time to adjust. So the finally having knowledge is overwhelming, and you really don't know how to put it all together. But eventually your eyes would fully adjust to the sunlight, and you finally see for the first time, and you have knowledge. Now, one of the most important things about the cave that probably makes it Plato's most important part of his teaching is that he says once one has escaped from the cave and is now out in the sunlight and can really see, and of course really has knowledge now, it is that person's responsibility to go back down into the cave and to share this journey out of the cave and what it is to have knowledge with others. And of course Plato used this to support his teacher Socrates, that Socrates is one who had come out of the cave and had knowledge. And what he did was to go back into the cave, go back into Athens to try to help others come to knowledge. But of course, the mob mentality we mentioned on the previous slide, they became angry at Socrates and thought of him as a traitor, even though he was trying to bring them into that greatest virtue or that greatest form of the good. Okay, there are going to be some concepts and terms I use on this slide that are not used in your textbook, so you'll need to pay careful attention here. What is mentioned in your textbook, however, is how these teachings of Plato on this dualistic epistemology, focusing on the concept of the forms, this has enormous implications for society and politics. Now, here are a couple of terms not in your textbook that you need to know. Plato is our first philosopher to make the distinction between deontological and teleological moral theories, and Plato is an advocate of the former, deontological. What this teleological, first of all, is what many of the sophists had argued for, and this is the idea that we describe today as the end justifies the means. So all you really look at is what are the consequences, what is the result of a decision or an action that is taken, and if you see that the consequence or the result is good, it doesn't matter what you had to do to get there, because ultimately you arrived at what is good. We would also call this an argument of instrumentality. Plato, however, felt functionality was more important. This is the term used by your author, that things in and of themselves, forms, concepts in and of themselves are good or lacking in goodness, and therefore we call this a deontological moral theory, that you don't do the end to justify the means, but in and of themselves things are good, and you should never stray from that. Therefore, Plato identified three basic kinds of persons that have particular functions, and if you're faithful to your particular function in society or in the polis, and just remember, polis is the Greek term for the city, and then that's where we get the term politics from. So within the polis, within the city, within society, there should be three basic types of people: the worker, the warrior, and the guardian, also called the philosopher king. And we do have Plato utilizing certain virtues that he considered tied to the polis and these three different functions of people working together. Now, you do need to know what the four primary virtues are that Plato proposes. One is temperance, or sobriety, and this means knowing how to live in moderation and never live to excess. And although this virtue is something that you would hope would be with all three functions of persons, this one is primarily tied to the worker. Now, the warrior, the military, in charge of protecting the polis, protecting the city, a primary virtue that's tied in there is courage, although again, you would hope that virtue would be shared by all three functions of persons. And then finally, the guardian, the philosopher king, tongue-in-cheek here, what we would call the politician today. I know many of us are not too fond of politicians today, but this would be the guardian, the philosopher king, and his primary virtue. Now again, today it would be his or her, but in Plato's world, just his primary function would be that of wisdom. And so now if we have temperance, courage, and wisdom all working together in these three functions, Plato then says we have a polis that is just. We have justice as the fourth and final virtue that is functioning within the city, functioning within the polis. Now, Plato had disdain for the primary political system that we're aware of, that of democracy. Of each person has their one vote. You have liberty for each person. He or she gets to choose what he wants to do, what kind of lifestyle he's going to live, based upon what resources he or she has available, what kind of job or vocation that person is going to have. Now, Plato thought because you're focusing so much on the individual in democracy, individual freedom, individual liberty, that this puts the individual person ahead of the society as a whole, and that eventually this will be self-defeating, that this will tear down the polis, this will tear down the society. And so as his alternative, we have Plato proposing utopias. And so this would be the ideal society, the perfect polis, the perfect city. And ironically enough today, just to give you a little illustration here, I've noticed how much of the literature and movies that are very popular with young people today, and I actually like them also, even though I'm not that young anymore, focus on the opposite of this, that of dystopias. And it's interesting to look at a couple of examples here that I'll give you of how it looks like these dystopias were trying to bring about Plato's utopias, but failed to do so. The two examples I'm speaking of here are the trilogy of books called The Hunger Games. Now, I've read those and, of course, seen the first couple of movies have come out. And what you see there is a government that has control and sees people as having particular functions within the polis, within the empire, within the nation. And so, of course, the government, the capital, thinks that if people will just obey their functions by whatever district they live in, then this will build a utopia. And what we actually see is a dystopia arrives. The other example, I have not read any of the books, but I saw a movie called Divergent that came out recently, and it's the first of a trilogy also. And here you also see a government entity, those that have power, selecting particular functions for people, thinking that this will help develop a utopia, and instead, once again, a dystopia comes about. All of that sort of concept and idea of whether people have functions or whether people have liberty, all of this stems from the teachings of Plato way back in the Republic 2,400 years ago. Now, again, Plato's counter-argument to these dystopias that I just presented in popular culture is what he calls the tyranny of excess, that once you continue to focus upon individuals having liberty and an individual getting to fulfill his or her desires being of utmost importance, all of that excess will eventually lead to a tyranny and the downfall of the democracy. And now finally something that your author did not cover at all that I wish he would have, and this is something I think is important for you to know. We haven't said anything really about how vice or evil or wickedness fit in with this concept of these perfect forms. If you have this perfect form or concept of the good, does that also mean that there is a form of perfection for evil, the opposite? Does that also have a form or concept? In other words, take what we had with the example in the textbook of Mother Teresa and replace that with Adolf Hitler. You could have a picture of Adolf Hitler, and then you would maybe see Adolf Hitler in person if you were living back in the 1930s or 40s, and so you have a greater idea of who Hitler is. And yes, he still go up to the next level. Yes, he is a human being. Now, you're hoping again with human being that the perfect, the highest virtue or highest form concept within the person would be the good. Now, Mother Teresa was a damn good example of that. You would say, yes, this is someone who certainly embodies the good. We see that form within her. But what would you do with Adolf Hitler? This idea of having to address forms as they relate to vice or evil will be prevalent in the teachings of some of those who come after Plato, and so we call this Neoplatonism, New Platonism. And so what we see here from Plato's students and those who come after him is teaching that these things that we call vices, the opposite of a virtue is a vice, that these are not forms, but what these are movements away from the form. And that's why I've given you this picture here. If you drop a pebble or a stone into a still body of water, you have these concentric circles that start to ripple away from the center. And so the idea here would be the Platonic form, the concept of the good, would be right in the center. That's what it is to be the form, the concept of good. But also, as you move away from that perfect form, as you get farther and farther away from it, we see the opposite can occur. And so evil or wickedness would be a movement away from the good. But according to Neoplatonism, evil, wickedness, selfishness, cowardice, intemperance, these things do not exist in and of themselves. They're not actual things that exist as forms, but only movements away from the form. Now, we need to realize that this has enormous impact for later thinkers. This thought will become especially prevalent by the most important Christian theologian after perhaps St. Paul. So again, if you have any interest in religion, the most important teacher in the church since Paul, who writes half of the New Testament, is a fellow named Augustine. And Augustine battled with this idea of good and evil having equal existence, and he could not accept that. And so he finally became someone who accepted this teaching of Neoplatonism, that evil or wickedness only exists as a movement away from the good. So realize that this is a question picked up by those who came after Plato, and this was the answer that they provided.